what does history prove? Uh, there was, when the Dead Sea Scrolls came out, which is, the ancient Hebrew writings of the Bible. And when they did the translation of the Dead Sea Scrolls,
Mm-hmm.
the Leviticus scroll or the Isaiah, whatever the scrolls they had. And here's what's interesting, and this is why we say history is important. That when they did the translations of the Leviticus scroll and other scrolls into English, and they compared the translation to Leviticus scroll to the King James, it almost read word for word. So God has the power to preserve. He said, well, I don't believe that. Shabbat Shalom. Welcome everybody to our Shabbat College class. Want to start by acknowledging our churches first, Bethel Temple and College here in Chicago. We say Shabbat Shalom to those that are in Nashville, Tennessee, and Coral Springs, Florida, to our evangelists in the Dominican Republic, and to our pastors in East and West Africa. We say Shabbat Shalom to you. We say Shabbat Shalom to all of our members that are around the United States that are watching us live via our stream, our live stream on Facebook at hashtag Restoration Gospel. Those that may be joining us on our YouTube channel at Bethel TV 1, we want to say Shabbat Shalom to you. We want to say welcome and Shabbat Shalom to those that may be visiting or watching this broadcast via those live streams. We want to welcome you to our Sabbath Class live. So we are 2 weeks, I believe, away, 2.5 weeks away from the Feast of Purim. And for those that have been in the class, when we start these new lessons or these new series of lessons, I like to always not take a real deep dive into that first lesson, but I want to go over it as if there are people who are listening or watching the first time. I want to go over the lesson so that you can understand the lesson in a way in which it should be delivered to people that you may be ministering or people that you may be talking to. I want to make sure that when we have these lessons, that we are always conscious of the people that you talk to are not the people that's in here. And so it's important to learn the most effective way to talk about these subjects. And there's a couple of things that we need to discuss, and I want to focus on, and I want you to focus on as we go through this lesson today. The first thing is I want you to always have in your mind throughout this class that you are talking to somebody who has never heard about the Feast of Purim. And your goal and your objective is for them to believe and to accept the Feast of Purim. We also are going to deal with a number of people who believe in the feast days that reject the Feast of Purim. So these are the two types of people that you're going to run across. Those that have never heard of the Feast of Purim, and you may be having a conversation. I don't know why you'll be having a conversation about the Feast of Purim, but it may come up. Everything that we teach, somebody's going to be converted on based off of whether it's the law, whether it's the Sabbath, whether it's Yisrael, whether it's the feast days. And so the Bible tells us to be ready to give an answer at all times. And so this phrase, I like to say, this is a high-level overview. This is not a deep dive. We'll do those deep dives next week. But again, as we go through, I want you to always think about throughout this lesson that you are communicating with somebody who don't know nothing about the Feast of Purim. Okay? So we're going to be focusing and answering a couple of key questions. Why is this important to the world? Apostle used to always talk about creating a demand. People have no clue about the Feast of Purim. Now, there may be people that have heard of the Day of Atonement of Yom Kippur. People may have heard of the Passover, but there are people who have never heard of the Feast of Purim. When you grew up in whatever denomination you were in, you probably rarely read the book of Esther. Okay? And then we want to talk about why it's important to those that are biblical believers, those that believe in the feast days, those that accept the Feast of Tabernacle and accept Yom Kippur. They reject this feast. One thing I want you to remember, and you got to find your sweet spot. And one of the things I focus on a lot in my ministry is showing that these things that we do are part of the gospel. Purim is part of the gospel. Now, I don't want to ask you to raise your hand or take a survey to find out who believes that they can show that Purim is part of the gospel. Now, mind you, Purim is in the Old Testament. When people talk about the gospel, they talk about the New Testament. So I'm not going to ask you to do it, but is there anybody who believes that they're comfortable in proving that Purim is part of the gospel? Okay. There should be a homework assignment in a paragraph or 2 paragraphs. Right? And so when we have these lessons, when you think about the question that I'm asking, if you can take from this lesson, and if you're able to formulate that paragraph or those 2 paragraphs showing that Purim is part of the gospel, you're halfway home. The majority of the people that you will come across are people that's in your family that are in Christianity, that say that they believe in the gospel. Now, why is it important to show that Purim is part of the gospel? I just want to take that survey. Now, here is where I want to hear your answer. Why is it important to show that Purim is part of the gospel? Amon?
It's important to show that Purim is part of the gospel because for a lot of psychological reasons, when you talk about the Old Testament and the New Testament and this Old Testament versus Christianity, when you prove that Purim is a part of the gospel, it'll open up the believer who probably more so necessarily has this idea that the Old Testament is done away with, because you show that it's not done away with, but it's actually tied into the gospel. And if it's a part of the gospel, it's something that you're supposed to be proclaiming and doing if you claim to be a follower or a believer of Christ.
Okay, good. Anybody else? Minister Yosef, why is it important to show that Purim is part of the gospel?
It's important to show that it's a part of the gospel because when you're speaking to someone in Christianity, mainly when they hear gospel, it's their definitions: life, death, burial, resurrection of Christ. So when it's important to show that it's a part of the gospel, to show how, because you need to connect Christ to this feast as well, in some way. So that's
okay.
Yep.
2 good answers. Remember, all of your friends, most of your friends, we need to find what we have in common. Like sometimes I used to see the saints talk to folks or call themselves witnessing to people, and you witnessing things that we don't have in common. I'm not saying that what we're ministering is wrong, but find something that's in common. Right? Why would somebody want to sit there and talk to you? Would you sit and talk to somebody about being a Satanist? Like, I don't want to hear that. We don't have that in common. What is it that we have in common? I don't know. We disagree, or we can agree that people are misinterpreting the Bible. I mean, I would use other things that we agree on if I wanted you to become a Satanist, right? You know, there are things that we agree with. But it's emotional things with Satanists. That the world is corrupt. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things. So we want to find those things that we have in common. And that will help us to relate. Now, with that being said, there's a couple of key Bible verses that tells our Christian friends that it is part of God's demand, if you will, that we accept the gospel in order to be saved. Now, you need to go through the Bible and find out where those verses are at. Does anybody know any verse before we get started that we need the gospel, that is mandatory if we want to enter into the kingdom? I'll give you one. We quote it all the time. I'll give you two keywords. What does it say? If I or an angel what? Preach any other gospel. Now, again, we have to go deeper now and find out what that gospel was that Paul taught. But here's what the Bible is saying. There's one gospel. And if you preach anything other than that or what's contained in that one gospel, that you're going to be under God's curse. That's what the Bible says. There's another Bible in 2 Thessalonians, the 3rd chapter, verse 14. It says, people are called to salvation through the gospel. So this is how we gain salvation, through the gospel. If you have any other gospel than that which Paul taught, you're going to be under God's curse. Now let's get them to agree on that. We can't go through now and prove everything that's in the gospel at this point. But we must get them to understand that if you don't have that gospel that Paul taught, if we don't have the gospel that was taught during the first century, then we have another gospel. That's going to be hard for people to accept. But we must stand on Yah's word. Okay? So Purim is part of the gospel. Dr. Tate.
I just wanted to share a Bible verse related to what we were discussing. It is coming from the book of Romans. I'm just lost it a second. Oh, here it is. Romans, the 1st chapter, verse 16.
Mm-hmm.
For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ.
I have that one too. Yep.
And then there's a colon here, so it's going to describe more of what it's talking about, referring to the gospel of Christ. For it is the gospel of Christ, the power of El unto salvation, to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. So even here it's showing that the gospel is the power of El unto salvation, for everyone that believe it. So if you can show that Purim is a part of the gospel, it's important that you believe in that and you do what you're supposed to with respect to the Feast of Purim if you're looking for salvation.
Sure. And then there's multiple steps, but you want to stir up curiosity. I think we make a huge mistake when we try to deliver the home run hit every time we get up. But you want to spark curiosity. Have confidence in yourself, but have confidence in the process. Sometimes you can give people too much, and it's too much. You know, Mashika said that. He said, you're not ready to receive this. Certain things they're not ready to receive. But talk with some sense. Prove your point thoroughly. Pique their curiosity. And now the ball is in their court. But sometimes we try to force them to accept it. And we try to give them so much. And it's hard to digest. It was funny because I was talking to Brother Baruch last night. He said, man, certain things on Passover, you know, when I came in, I was like, you know, that's too much for me. And so he came to this Passover, and then he went to the other Passover where he was going, just in case we was off and crazy. He said, man, I saw it, but there was a block. When you guys are talking about the two different land, male and female, he said, I heard it and I saw it, but I think it was a year later that it really started to click. And so just because it's in the Bible and you feel real good about yourself because you can point to the Bible and you think that you can explain it real well, doesn't mean it click with folks. So you got to leave them room to grow. And that's in your life, period. You don't get in a relationship and say, I can't be with him. He leave the toilet seat up. Man, it was been only 2 days. Right? You got to give folks room to grow. And the same thing applies in the Bible. You got to give folks room to grow because it's a shock. It was a shock for me. I said, you going to come again? You going to do what? On Passover? I'm like, no. He's like, no, brother, look. Hey, brother, look, nothing. I see it in the Bible. But that was just, it's too much. Right? So we're going to go through this. We're going to take our time in going through this. And we want to deliver this message in a way that if anybody was here today, if anybody was listening today, they may say, I have some questions, but I can't reject what you gave me today. And that's what you want to do with people, okay? So let's go ahead and turn to our first page, obeying every word. If I can get a reader to begin to read obeying every word.
Obeying every word. The Bible stated that all scripture is given by inspiration of God, or L, and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. Timothy 3:16. The book of Esther is part of the Bible, and so we must accept it as inspired writings that came from or were influenced by the Father. Those who accept the Bible tend to not accept the holy feast days, including the Feast of Purim, as a legitimate biblical festival that must be celebrated today. Every event that occurred throughout biblical times was not recorded, John 21:25 said, and there are also many other things which Yashach, or Jesus, did, the which, if they should be written every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. Amen. John 21:25. We express our love toward El by way of obedience because El works through man on earth to carry out his will. We must be obedient to the things that these divinely inspired men and women gave.
Okay, let's stop and talk about that. Who can give some context to that, to what we just read? Let's just start with the first part. The Bible stated that all scripture is given by the inspiration of El and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, and for instruction in righteousness. The book of Esther is part of the Bible. And so we must accept it as inspired writings that came from or were influenced by the Father. What can we do with that? A couple of people had Dr. Tate hand up. Amon. Zaria, your hand up. Zaria? Okay. Go ahead, Zaria.
So 2 Timothy 3:16, when it says all scripture is given by inspiration of El and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. That's telling us that whatever is in the Bible, well, first off, it said that there was a lot of things that El did that the books couldn't contain. So whatever he did put in the Bible, he felt it necessary to have in there for like those things that was listed. And so if he put the Feast of Purim in the Bible, then that's one of the things that he wanted us to follow.
Okay. Does everybody understand? Well, does that make sense? Okay. I don't want to comment on this, so we'll keep moving on. If anybody else want to comment before Amon had his hand up, Dr. Tate, did you have your hand up? Or Dr. Tate, you had your hand up next. Go ahead, Dr. Tate, again.
Our sister Azari did such a great job. I just want to say ditto. It's not like we can pick and choose what parts of the Bible were inspired by God. It's one conversation to have if you're someone who doesn't believe the Bible is inspired by God. That's a totally separate conversation. But if you already understand and accept and believe in the Bible, it's important to recognize this Bible verse because it reminds us that It's not like a pick and choose type of situation. So if you believe that Genesis was inspired by God, then you should also believe that Esther was inspired by God, and that he left this record for a particular reason, for doctrine, for correcting us, for instruction in righteousness. It wasn't just because. God is not the author of confusion, and his ways are holy and his works are holy. And so the fact that he has this inspired writing that he's left for us, even all these thousands of years later, he left it for a reason.
Yeah.
And so we should acknowledge that and understand
Yes.
that.
Everything in the Bible was given for our learning. Everything that's in the Bible was given as part of doctrine. Things that we must do. We can correct people because of the things that are written in the Bible. So when people say, you can't judge me, I can judge you. The Bible says judge righteously, judge a righteous judgment. When things are in the Bible, and the Bible said that this feast, called the Feast of Purim, must be kept from year to year throughout all of our generations, then that was a commandment. If it was kept during the time of Esther in the BC period, and we see that it was a feast day that should be celebrated or must be celebrated from year to year by all the Jews, then what do you think happened with Christ? Was Christ a Jew? Right? So if Christ was a Jew, I don't care if you don't see it written in what we call the New Testament, because they didn't have in the New Testament what we call the New Testament. Remember? The folks of the New Testament, their Bible was the Old Testament. There was no New Testament written. It was being written, but it wasn't published. So they wasn't living by what was written in what we call the New Testament. And so all scripture is given by the inspiration of El. There was something else that you said, Dr. Tate, that just slipped my mind. People are keen. Probably for over the last, I'll throw a number out, maybe 700 years, 600 years. From year to year, nobody has ever in any year skipped Christmas. Whenever they start celebrating Thanksgiving, there has never been a year when Thanksgiving wasn't celebrated. Now, that was man's day. That was man's creation. And so why do we think that God has these holy feast days that he said we must celebrate forever? Now, Dr. Tate read a Bible verse in Romans, the first chapter, verse 16. You remember what that Bible verse said? Romans, the first chapter, verse 16. It says the gospel is the power of El. It's the power of God unto salvation. It said to who? The Jew first, and then to the Greek. Another Bible verse says to the Jew and to the Gentile. So although we are focusing on a Jewish festival, people say, well, I'm not a Jew. Exclude me. It said it was given to the Jew first. And the Jew was supposed to bless the entire world by teaching the entire world that they must keep this feast. Okay? What about this next part? Where it talked about, Azaria touched on it, and there are also many other things which Yasha did, the which, if they should be written, every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. Can you imagine filling this world up with books? If you fill this building up with books, that's a whole, I can't read that many books in my life. No, I can't stay focused that long, Dr. Tate. Can you imagine how much Yah did in his life? If the Bible talked about that, hey, so I can't say you going to hell, but you saw the miracles. You saw things all those years. I mean, probably every hour on the hour. Y'all like, boom, did it. And they still didn't believe. So don't take it strange when they tell you, get your black self out of my face. I want to hear what you got to say. But yet, this story found its way in the Bible. So it should be expressing to us how important this is. Let's read Romans, the 13th chapter, verse 1 and 2. Sister Constance, you want to finish reading that?
Romans 13, 1 through 2. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which El has established.
Let everyone be under this authority, right? Let everyone be subject to it. Come on.
The authorities that exist have been established by El. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what El has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves.
Is that self-explanatory? Does that need to be? Do we need to talk about that? Does anybody have anything on that? Go ahead, Minister Yosef. Are we pushed up over there? Are you pushed up?
I've seen this verse plenty of times, but I looked at it in a different light and looking at Purim, because during that time, Esther, she was in authority. And I'm looking at it as, this was established by El through her.
Yeah.
And now it's saying obey the governing authorities.
Yeah.
She was in authority during that time. So that's another reason why, this feast must be observed as well.
Absolutely. She was a governing authority. It was in the book. People say, was she a female? She was a governing authority. No, could no man do it right. And God put her in the position to do what she did. And when you look at the Jews, it didn't say, and we'll get to reading that Bible verse, but it didn't say that all the Pharisees are going to be killed or all the Essene Jews are going to be killed. All the Jews were going to be killed. It didn't matter what. If it say that all blacks are going to be killed, I don't care if you was a Baptist, if you was an atheist, if you was gay, it don't matter. Your black self is going to die. Right? So it was the same when it talked about the Jews, because there are some people that will suggest, well, it was talking about the Jews, over here in this land. It was talking about a certain type of Jews. It was talking about all Jews. And the edict or the law that was made for all Jews to celebrate it. Right? And we'll go into that maybe a little bit here, but we'll talk about it again next week. Okay? So why is celebrating the Feast of Purim so special? Let me get another reader. I want you to really pay close attention to these next two paragraphs. I think it's important. Again, we talk about this stuff, and what we talk about in about an hour and a half, you can formulate a 2-minute sentence or a minute sentence and destroy people's argument. That's why it's important for you to pay attention to the class and then to meditate on what we're talking about. A lot of this stuff you can summarize. You're going to have conversations where you're not going to be able to sit at a table with light shining on you and have a 2-hour conversation with somebody. So how do I condense it and prove my point? How do I rattle or shake somebody into a conscious state where it's clicking and starting to make sense? Okay, let's go, Minister Yosef.
Why is celebrating the Feast of Purim so special? Purim is a joyous Jewish festival commemorating the survival of the Jews who, in the 5th century BCE, were marked for death in one day by the Persian rulers.
They were marked for death. There's nothing, people talk about the Holocaust. Over 6 million Jews, European Jews, were killed. They wasn't killed in one day. And so I'm always amazed and intrigued by this feast. Can you just imagine? I think this was going to happen a year later. Can you imagine the amount of planning that the enemy was doing? Wait a minute, hold on. I want to know where the Jews are in every house. I want to know where every hiding spot can possibly be. If I'm going to kill them all in one day, that means that was an extraordinary plot to make sure you know where every person was at, to make sure that you have identified in a whole person. This is in the kingdom. Can you imagine even doing that in Chicago? We're talking about a kingdom. A kingdom are a number of different countries, right? That means you know what a barn, you know where there's a hole underneath the barn, you know everything, because in 24 hours, in a 24-hour period, you're going to destroy all the Jews. Okay? Keep reading.
The story is related in the biblical book of Esther. Haman, chief minister of King Ahasuerus, incensed that Mordecai, a Jew, held him in disdain and refused obeisance, respect by bowing or to show homage. Convinced the king that the Jews living under Persian rule were rebellious and should be slaughtered. With the king's consent, Haman set a date for the execution, the 13th day of the month of Adar, by casting lots, and built gallows for Mordecai. What would have happened if Haman was successful in his plot to annihilate the Jews? There would be no Christ. There would be no Bible. There would be no salvation. There would be no world. This understanding of the potential disaster that the world faced is worthy of a worldwide celebration for what Yah had done.
Now, it's stated here. I want to hear from you the severity of what was about to take place, or how this could have affected the future from what we read. Can somebody tell me how this would have affected our future? Huh? Yeah, it's on the paper. But I want to hear Amon. I don't want you to read it, but I want us to really understand and grasp the severity of what was about to take place.
So yeah, for context, the basis of what I'm gonna answer this on, I'm gonna start a little bit back in Genesis with Abraham and then Jacob. Yah told Abraham and Jacob, in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So that means that something was going to happen through the seed of Abraham and going down into where salvation was supposed to reach the entire earth and the whole world.
Through who?
Through Mashiach. So we don't know that yet up at this point, but however, we know that that's continuously taking place. You know, Yah chose a certain people, Yisrael, to give his laws, his commandments, and salvation was going to come through Mashiach, through this line. So according to what we just read, if all the Jews were destroyed, there would have never been a lineage for Christ to continue to come and then save the entire world from. This was a plot to kill every single Jew, so there wouldn't have been a Jew left. There wouldn't have been a Jew left for Christ to be able to come and do the things that he did and the things that the Bible prophesied about if all the Jews were destroyed.
Okay. Does everybody understand that? There would not have been, listen, God had a divine plan from the beginning. And his divine plan was that he was going to form a people who we know as the Jews, Hebrews, Jews, whatever. He was going to form a people, and he was going to give his message of salvation to his people. And his people were going to go around the entire world until he comes back and teach this message of salvation, or preach the kingdom message to the entire world. That was done. When God says something, when he sets something in motion, he can't take back from what he set in motion. And the Bible said, we read in Romans the first chapter, to the Jew first, and then to the Gentile. Well, there couldn't have been a Jew first if the Jews would have been destroyed. There could not have been a forerunner, John the Baptist. There could not have been Peter and Paul. There could not have been Joseph and Mary, because their ancestors were living through during that time in the Persian Empire. So if there's no Jews, there's no Christ. There's no world. There's nothing for us. Okay? Amon?
Yeah, to go along with what you just said, there are plenty of instances in the Bible where the Bible, before a chapter would start, would talk about the lineage and how you got there. And pretty much, thinking about it, all of those names that you would read, the son of, the son of, the son of, and they got together, all of that would have never, been in there. So it's so severe, because the Bible is telling you that all these lineages that you're reading, that the Bible actually wrote down and decided to tell us, none of those would exist. So as you were saying, there would be no Joseph, there would be no Mary, et cetera, et cetera. So
Yeah, absolutely. So that's important for us. If we can't explain anything more than that, if that don't do it for you, then there's an issue with you of how important this feast is. Now, somebody will say something out left field. Well, how come it wasn't in Leviticus 23rd chapter? Well, this hadn't happened yet, right? But we have to understand, and we'll go deeper into it next week, understanding the authority by which Queen Esther was able to make this a law for all of Israel, right? That's the huge problem that we have to deal with. What gave her the authority to establish something for all Jews forever? And since it wasn't in Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, they'll say, well, we don't have to do it because it wasn't in Leviticus, the 23rd chapter. All right, let's go ahead and read Esther, the 3rd chapter, verse 5. This shows you the amount of hate that Haman had in his heart.
When Haman,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes.
Now that's some hate for you. It said that he wanted to know. It said Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people. Now we say that today, who are your peoples? They talking about all your family live over there on Hamlin or somewhere, or on the south side of Chicago, or who are your peoples? No, he talking about, I'm going to destroy all Jews. Now that was some deep hate. He was hurt. He was to say, I'm going to destroy an entire nation of people because you won't bow down to me. So, I mean, it kind of shows you, and it makes sense, how deep this plot was to kill them all in one day. We're not going to kill them all when we see them. If I see you in the store, you dead, Jew. He said, we're going to kill them all in one day. Okay. I don't know, but I do know, I forget how many people were in the Persian Empire, and I forget how many countries made up. But that was the majority of the world. I do know that between 650,000 or about 650,000 came out of Egypt. Now you talking about 400, 500 years. You think about how people multiply. So I don't know. I'm assuming well over a million. I'm sorry? Okay. Yeah. I can't remember how many people was in the Persian Empire. I don't even know if they had a census that they recorded about how many were there. But 700,000 still going to be killed in one day. And we do know in that empire, again, was Christ folks and all the apostles folks. Everybody wiped out. The future generations that we now read about in our New Testament writings would not have existed. Okay. All right, let's talk about a nationally recognized feast by all Jews.
A nationally recognized feast. El assumed responsibility for setting the precedence for every other solemn assemblies belonging to his people. This allowed nationally recognized chief leader of God's people to mandate and proclaim it as legal. It as a legal, nationally recognized holy day of assembly.
Okay, so this is one of the things that we have to talk about next week. That there is this precedent that was set in the Bible that allow nationally recognized holidays. There were instances in the Bible where the leaders, now it only happened 2 times, but where the leaders can call for a national solemn assembly that's to be kept from year to year. Now, there are other people that called for a solemn assembly that wasn't in Leviticus. So there are instances in the Bible, and we'll see that next week, where somebody called a solemn assembly. Now, what they can't call is what? Only God can establish holy convocation. That's what we see in Leviticus, the 23rd chapter. And so when people think about the feast days, the Bible in the book of, I believe, is Isaiah, that it gave us a commandment to blow the shofar in the new moon and at the full moon. That wasn't given to us in Leviticus, the 23rd chapter. But if we blowing up the shofar before El, that means that's a solemn assembly, that we are coming to his house and we are celebrating or acknowledging the new moon and the full moon. Is that scripture? That we got to keep the new moon and full moon? That's scripture. That's not in Leviticus, the 23rd chapter. Okay? Let's keep reading because of the rationale.
Because of the rationale behind the rejection and or dismissal of Purim is more likely to have been due to not being listed among the other festivals in Leviticus than for any other reason, it must be understood that every holy convocation is a solemn assembly, but every solemn assembly is not a holy convocation. For only El is responsible for establishing a holy convocation, and man was never given the authority to institute a no work, no servile work day independent of El.
Okay. Is there anybody who don't understand that? I think we haven't went over this much, Sister Constance, the difference between a holy convocation and solemn assembly. Have we? Okay. Does anybody have any questions on holy convocations and solemn assemblies? So, what are the characteristics of a holy convocation? It is. Holy convocation is right. Yeah. Right. So, with a holy convocation, there's a solemn assembly inside a holy convocation. Solemn assembly means we are called out people, Yisrael. We come into his house, Bethel, right? And we come in, called by somebody in authority. And the only difference is with the holy convocation, it's a no work day. Can't nobody ever, under no circumstance, say that we are having a holy convocation, and it's not in Leviticus 23rd chapter. Nobody can ever say that. If we tell you that the moon service is a holy convocation, you need to walk out that door. If we say we're going to establish a feast day in July and it's a holy convocation, you need to walk out that door. Yeah, or put me out. Well, yeah, hey, that'll be easier. But we're going to see in Joel, the first chapter, verse 13 and 14, that there was a time where they called for a feast day. And guess what? All of Israel came. All right, let's read Joel, the first chapter, verse 13 through 14.
Gird yourselves and lament, ye priests, howl, you ministers of the altar. Come, lie all night in sackcloth, ye ministers of my God. For the meat offering and the drink offering is withholden from the house of your God. Sanctify ye a fast and call a solemn assembly. Gather the elders and all the inhabitants of the land into the house of the Yahweh your Elohim, and cry unto the Yahweh.
Okay. So we see here that, first of all, do we see where Yisrael is at? Do we see the people of Yisrael? This was talking to Yisrael. When it says, gather the elders and all the inhabitants of the land, it wasn't talking about the pagans. But it says, gather them into the house of the Lord. Do we see Bethel there? Okay. All right. It says, and cry unto the Yahweh. Now, the Feast of Purim, and we talked about this earlier, there's something unique about the Feast of Purim. There are a lot of events that happen in the Bible. There were a lot of fights that Yisrael fought. Yah fought with them, and they won. But the Feast of Purim was recorded in the book. Can somebody tell me why that's significant? And I think I'm asking the same thing a different way. Why is that significant that the Feast of Purim was found in the book? Well, without Queen Esther and what they did, it wouldn't be no Yisrael. But why is it important that it's recorded in the book? I mean, it was a significant event that happened. It was so significant that it was recorded. We talked about earlier that everything, I asked this question, I don't know if it was last year, a couple of years ago. I asked a question. You guys try to debate me on this. Is everything that Christ did, was it important? You guys remember that question? You all tried to fight, beat me up. But was everything that Christ did, of course he's Christ. He's perfect. It was important for whatever it was important for, but was everything that Christ did given to us? Was all his miracles told? So was it significant for us today? Well, is it important for us, all the miracles he did? Huh? So if it was important and it was supposed to provide us with some sort of learning, if we were supposed to get something out of it, wouldn't it make sense that it'll be in the book? Right? And it wasn't. So why is it important about Purim being recorded in a book? We're getting something from it. It's some doctrine. There's some reproof. There's something that we're supposed to get out of that. And we talked about, Brother Baruch, before you got here. One of the things that we'll eventually show is that Purim is part of the gospel. Just because the gospel is quote unquote, people look at the gospel in the New Testament. Well, let me ask this question. Is the gospel just from the New Testament? Well, was Christ prior to the New Testament? Where did the gospel come from? It did? Who said Old Testament? You said the gospel came from the Old Testament? Yes, I mean, did it? Or no? Okay. Now I'm being a little rough on you because I'm playing. I'm playing. Give brother Baruch. Hey, stand by what you say. Just because I kind of get loud or whatever, don't.
Can we get a working definition of the gospel?
Can you get a working definition of the gospel?
Functional.
Yeah, I give you something functional. It leads to salvation. It leads to salvation. So, huh? It leads to salvation. Okay. I'm asking a question. Dr. Tate?
As you say often, I think it is important that we be reminded that the Bible that they were using in the New Testament times, when he was in the synagogues and he was reading and they were teaching what we know as the Old Testament. They were living out the New Testament dispensation. Like, that stuff wasn't written. And so they were teaching the things that were found in the Old Testament. So when he says to go ye therefore into all nations and teach everything that I have commanded you, the things that he commanded them were contained, some of them in the Old Testament. So going up to the different feasts that we see, that's contained in the Old Testament. To prepare the Passover, that's also in the Old Testament. And so they were teaching from the Old Testament. So yes, in fact, the Old Testament is a part of the gospel. Now, there are certain things that Christ shared with us that were not in the Old Testament, but the Old Testament even then told us and foretold that he was going to come and share with us something that was not given to us initially in the Old Testament. So even that made room for Christ and what he taught in the New Testament in the Old Testament. So yes, the Old Testament is a part of the gospel. I'd even say that it's the foundation of it.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Is it supposed to be red?
Try the other one. Try to use the other one. Get that to Amy to get her two batteries in there. No, get two batteries out of there.
That was a great response, Dr. Ted. I also just wanted to add that Mashiach Christ, when improved himself from the Old Testament, starting at the Old Testament. So if Christ is our perfect example, he's the giver of salvation. And by him showing us that he could prove himself from the Old Testament, it shows how valuable the Old Testament is and how the gospel started there.
Okay. I think that's Luke 24:21, I believe. Yeah, Luke 24:21. It says, beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded on the things pertaining to himself. So he he proved himself from the Old Testament. Everything he taught, matter of fact, the Bible talked about him being the chief cornerstone. It says that the gospel was built off of the foundation of the prophets and the apostles. Okay? Minister Yosef?
Yeah, I just want to share this one Bible verse. Hebrews 4, verse 2, it says, "For unto us was the gospel preached, as well as unto them. But the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that had heard it." And it's talking about the people that came way before from the Old Testament. So that's showing that the gospel did start back then because it was preached then.
Yeah. Moses laid the groundwork for what Mashiach taught, for what Christ taught. And it's funny because I always say, you talk about the law. Christ said in a couple of places, he said, it has been said of old that thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not kill. He built off of that. He said, but I say unto you, if you angry at your brother without cause, you know you are guilty of murder. He's telling you that the sin starts in the mind, but he built off of what Moses, thou shalt not commit adultery, but I say unto you, as soon as you lust in your mind, you are guilty So Christ made it, if you want to say more difficult, he made it more difficult than what Moses and what they had in the Old Testament.
When you just said Moses, I just thought about some. Christ said it. I think it's in John 6 or chapter 5. He said, "If you don't believe Moses, neither will you believe me, because Moses wrote about me." So he telling you that it started back then.
Okay. So this feast there's something I can't wait to go over. It was written in the book. Let's read Purim recorded in the book. We talked a little bit about this already, but let's just go ahead and read that.
The Feast of Purim, however, was recorded in the book, Bible. Therefore, it must have been important to the Father and for the Jews. This feast was to be kept by all the Jews.
Okay. Let's read Esther. I believe this is the 9th chapter, and we're going to read verses 27 down through 32. If I can get another reader. I want you to remember this in your head, because you're going to have to continue reference back to the Jew first. Because we keep talking about it. We keep talking about the Jews, and we keep talking about this was for the Jews. You accept Christ, or you don't reject Christ. He was a Jew. But when we start looking at these Bible verses where it talk about the Jews, and this is for the Jews, you say, well, I don't want that. I'm not a Jew. Well, why do you want Christ then? Because he was a Jew. And everything that he taught was part of his Jewish culture. So let's go ahead and read Esther, the 9th chapter, verse 27 through 32.
The Jews ordained and took upon them and upon their seed and upon all such as joined themselves unto them.
Whoa. What does that mean? Huh? Right? So this is to the stranger, right? Anybody that joined themselves unto them was part of them. And so the Bible is showing to the Jew first and to the Gentiles even here. Okay? Come on.
So as it should not fail, that they would keep these 2 days according to their writing and according to their appointed time every year, and that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, and that these days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor the memorial of them perish from their seed. Then Esther the queen, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew, wrote with all authority to confirm this second letter of Purim. And he sent the letters unto all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the king of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim in their times appointed, according as Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had enjoined them, and as they had decreed for themselves and for their seed the matters of the fastings and their cry. And the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book.
Okay. So this was written in a book. People say, oh, that was written in their civil constitution, their civil books. It was, well, I don't care where else it was written. I know it was written in the Bible. And I think it's important, although I got it underlined here, I didn't really pay much attention to it, that those that joined themselves unto the Jews had to keep this feast. Now, there's a Bible verse in Esther as well that said many people of the land became Jews for fear of the Jews. So if there are people who were not Jews and now they became Jews, what do you think they did the following year? Right? So those people that became Jews, that became a part of the nation, kept this feast as well. Okay? Now, I think this is very important. If we look on our next page, you know, there are a lot of feasts that maybe you didn't know. But do you know there are a lot of feast days that those in Judaism keep? That's not Leviticus, the 23rd chapter. I mean, there got to be about at least 16 other feast days that they keep. And Elder Nate used to fool around with those guys when he was in Alaska. So, he didn't know. Not that he, took part in it, but they got some crazy. They got a whole bunch of stuff that's not biblical. So if we can look at this graph at this sheet, do you see the main feast days in modern Judaism? There are things that they've been keeping for hundreds of years. You know what's interesting about these feast days that they've been keeping over 500, 600 years? 700 years, 1,000 years? They're not found in the Bible. So Yah has the ability to control what is put in the Bible and what's not. Can you imagine if we see the New Year's for the trees in the Bible? You know, the Bible's going to have to be very specific that this is not for believing Jews. So that we won't be confused, Yah kept that stuff out. This is his book. All scripture is given by the inspiration of El. So he has the ability to exclude or keep out those things that don't come from him. And so there are a number of different feast days, and I had a whole list of them. So if you look within Judaism, and you can do that on your spare time, you're going to see there are feast days. They got the feast for, what was it, the eve of Esther? Or they got so many feast days that are not part of the Bible. Okay, and this is just 5 different ones that they observe that we don't see. Okay.
So is this an example then of a leader from this sect that made their own?
Are you saying this is this an example of the leaders making up their own feast days?
Yeah, well, not a feast day, but not a holy convocation.
A solemn assembly? Well, yeah. I mean, this is not part of really a denomination. This is just Judaism as a whole. Now, of course, just like Christianity, you got ultra-Orthodox, you got moderates, you got different type of Jews. But in Judaism as a whole, they celebrate all these feast days. You don't necessarily even see it in Christianity. I mean, you think about Christianity. You don't see.
They have like revivals and like pastors like appreciation with like once a year.
Yeah.
Like, those are
Yeah.
individualized and based on like different denominations. The list is everybody.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying.
Yeah. So, yeah, within Christianity, it's really, I mean, the same thing. Not everybody celebrate Lent, but at least 2 billion people celebrate Lent. Ash Wednesday. Not everybody celebrate Ash Wednesday, but a majority of people in Christianity, they do. And so it's the same thing. You know, we see it here in Judaism, but the same thing happened in Christianity. There are a whole bunch of things. I didn't really realize until several years ago that Mardi Gras is a part of the religious. Now, it's a part of it. The Catholic Church documented, but I don't see too many churches doing. You know, folks just go down to Louisiana, right? That's what it is, right? Yeah, go down to Louisiana for Mardi Gras. And it's a big old, party. But it was part of the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church is the mother horde, so everything came out of the Catholic Church. And so you see the adoption of a lot of these celebrations and practices throughout the different religious denominations. So one of the things that, and we're nearing the end, one of the things that we hear all the time from people is, I don't see God. Now, I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with this story in Esther or that saying that I don't see God in this story. Has anybody heard that before? Okay. God is not mentioned. Yeah. So this was a book that they debated taking this out the Bible. 1776 or something like that. And what we call the lost book of the Bible, the Apocrypha, the Maccabees, they really struggled and debated about taking Esther out and making that a part. Because is it really part of the Bible? Should it be a part of the Bible? because we see a bunch of Esther and we see a bunch of Mordecai doing some things, but we don't see God. If you ever, when you get a chance, you go home and Google Purim, where is God? And that's been a debate. So let's go ahead and read I don't see God. And if you go back and look at the story, read the story, there's not this communication with the Father like you see him communicating with Moses or him communicating with Paul. There's no conversation. Mordecai and Esther is constantly having this dialogue, and Esther's telling Mordecai, this is what I'm going to do, and you go tell the people to do the same, but you don't see God speaking to them. So let's go ahead and read this. I don't see God.
I don't see God, a physical breakthrough. Sackcloth and ashes were used in the Old Testament times as a symbol of debasement, mourning, and or repentance. Someone wanting to show his repentant heart would often wear sackcloth, sit in ashes, and put ashes on top of his head. Ashes accompanied sackcloth in times of national disaster or repenting from sin. In Esther chapter 4 and 1, for instance, describes Mordecai tearing his clothes, putting on sackcloth and ashes, and walking out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. This was Mordecai's reaction to King Xerxes' declaration giving the wicked Haman's authority to destroy the Jews. Mordecai was not the only one who grieved. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lie in sackcloth and ashes.
So when you think about these ancient times, like this is something that's weird. We see them in sackcloth and ashes. If you see somebody in sackcloth and ashes, what does that say about them? I want you to think about everything that being in sackcloth and ashes says about a person. Dr. Tate? Where does that come from?
Well, that's one of the ways in which you can see you can see God in the book of Esther is when you are going into sackcloth and ashes, you're doing it for a reason. You're doing it because you're trying to humble yourself and to appease God and to get him to move on your behalf. This is not the only time in the Bible we see someone in the Bible going into sackcloth and ashes, someone praying to Yah, going through a difficult time. And so that is something that is a part of the Jewish culture. And by that I mean Jewish in the sense of the Hebrew culture, right? God's culture, that his people would go in sackcloth and ashes as a way to appease God and to get him to move on their behalf.
Well, that's what I wanted you to say. Did you have your hand up? That's what I wanted you to say. It is part of a unique culture. Like, that doesn't happen. Sackcloth and ashes are not done by the pagans. That don't mean nothing to them. Why am I getting dirty and putting on this itchy material? That's something that came from the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so if I were to see a person in sackcloth back then and ashes and sitting with ashes on their head, it tells me a couple of things about them. Number one, it tells me that they're Hebrew. Number two, what else does it tell me about them? They need a breakthrough. They need a breakthrough. They need a serious breakthrough. And what was the Jews facing at this time? In one day. Now, they should have had several sackcloths on. Because one day, there's nowhere I can hide. The fact that this was to occur, I don't care what you say about it being luck. When you read the story, the fact that this was to occur in one day, and they went through this spiritual operation. You know, sackcloth and ashes is a spiritual operation. And the fact that they were delivered from annihilation, in fact, they got the upper hand. Yah gave them so much favor and so much power that the Bible said many of the land became judgment. We don't want to fight you. Whoever your God is, that is now my God. Have you served, that's how I'm going to serve. And so when we see the deliverance through the spiritual operation of sackcloth and ashes, you see God. You see God operating and moving. You know, there's a number of Bible verses in the Old Testament that he said, in your time, in your times of trouble, he said, I will deliver you. God understood that I've made a covenant with my people. And so whatever happens in our lives, if it was to happen again today, here's one thing that I can take refuge in. That God got to save somebody. He got to save some of you, Israel. Because the Bible says, in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Now, I might fight, I may get killed, but I still know that Yah is going to come through. He got to come through. He got to preserve his people. Now, I'm not saying that everybody who went to fight against the enemy, because you know there was still a fight, right? I'm not saying everybody that fought survived. I'm not saying that. But the nation as a whole was saved. All right? Yes, sir.
Told off of the remarks set out, but just to make sure I understand right, what you are saying is that it's impossible for the nation as a whole to lose.
It's impossible.
Right. Y'all wouldn't have his people there. You know, he wouldn't be able to fulfill any of those promises he gave us. So as a whole, it's impossible for us to fail.
Sure. It's impossible. Now, hey, don't get it wrong. You can be so messed up that he can do you like he did Israel in the wilderness. He said, well, he's not going to destroy the nation the whole way. Was it 8? There was only a handful that got into the promised land. So 99% of those folks that came out of Egypt, he destroyed them. So don't say, well, I don't have to worry. Y'all's going to keep the people. Hey, you might be one of the ones that's gone. So, yeah. But he has to preserve the nation. All right, let's move to this our last section. How do I know that Christ kept this feast? Remember, we talked about finding what we have in common. Here's what we have in common with our Christianity friends. Is I believe in Christ, they believe in Christ. I believe in the gospel, they believe in the gospel. Right, we got that in common. We already talked about the gospel part. But we have to show, which would be a little bit more difficult, but we have to show that Christ kept it. And we kind of talked about it already. So I think that everybody should be able to respond and show clearly that Christ kept it. But let's go ahead and read this last section.
How do I know that Christ kept the feast? Although the New Testament writers never mention the Feast of Purim, we know that Christ was obedient to that which came before him. Here are a few ways that we know that Christ kept the feast. 1, he was a Jew, and the feast was celebrated by all Jews worldwide. 2, Christ kept another feast day that was not mentioned in the book of Leviticus. This feast day was ordained by the Maccabees and the Jews in the book of Maccabees, the Apocrypha.
Stop. Is that an important piece to use? It's important to see that in the Old Testament, the Feast of Dedication, also known as Chanukah, as the world knows it as Hanukkah, that Christ went up in John, the 10th chapter, was it? That he went up to the Feast of Dedication. It's important to know that the Feast of Trumpet is in Leviticus, the 23rd chapter. But the Bible doesn't mention Christ keeping the Feast of Trumpets. right? So the Bible doesn't have to be redundant. We said it, we say it often, that all Christ had, all they had in the first century and the second century and the third century was the writings of the Old Testament. It wasn't until late 4th century that the New Testament books that we read now were published. So for all these years, that was their Bible. Minister Yosef.
My question was the Purim. What was the time frame from Kanuka from Purim?
I thought it was. I don't want to. I thought it was less than 115 years. I can't remember exactly.
Okay, so
450. I have to look.
and Purim came. I mean, Kanuka was after Purim.
I think.
Is it?
Let me get the exact dates. But go ahead. Is that just your question?
No, I was asking that because I mean, if he kept Kanuka and Kanuka came after Purim, so quite naturally he would have had kept that one anyway.
Sure. I'll get those exact dates of the year of Purim. 365. It was 365. 365 BC. And then the Feast of Dedication. We'll get that. The Maccabees was in 175 BC. So Purim was before Maccabees. 175. Yeah, 100 and something years apart. And so that means then that the Maccabees kept Purim. Right? The Bible don't have to tell us they kept Purim. Or the Bible don't have to tell us that it kept the feast days in Leviticus, the 23rd chapter. But because it was ordained. And then, so we look for patterns, right? We look for patterns that we see that Christ kept tabernacle. We see that Christ, matter of fact, the Bible didn't even talk about Christ keeping Yom Kippur. It talked about him keeping Passover, the Sabbath, and tabernacle. So since that was in Leviticus 23rd, I know he kept all the feast days in Leviticus the 23rd. The Bible doesn't talk about Christ keeping Purim, but because he kept the Feast of Dedication, right? And so we can see and show these patterns of what Christ did. Okay. All right. And then we have one more, 3.
Number 3 says, Christ said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, "Think not that I come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill." Mordecai and Esther were a prophet and prophetess.
Right. So the prophets can be described as the books that come after the books of the law, the first 5 books. But the prophets and prophetess were also those that were dictating, in many cases, the Old Testament. And so he said, I didn't come to do away with the prophets, but I came to fulfill or to do what the prophets and prophetess spoke of. And so, you know, I really enjoy this feast, and I really understand the purpose surrounding this feast. It should be celebrated with as much joy and enthusiasm and passion that Passover is celebrated. Now, while Yah gave Passover as a holy convocation, he inspired all the feast days. And we come and we celebrate. We celebrate those that fought, those that had the courage to stand up. You know, you got to have some courage in this faith. You're going to have to fight during your time on earth in this faith. And so we celebrate because we have Christ, that we have a good shot at salvation. We celebrate because Yah told us to celebrate for what he has done and how he has delivered the children of Israel in times of complete annihilation. And so Yah is good. And I'm encouraged to know that he doesn't change. And just like he came to their rescue, I'm talking about as a nation. If he can rescue a nation, what can he do in your personal life? We can fast and we can pray. And we can still go down in sackcloth. El wants us to succeed. And not just succeed, he wants us to thrive. Why? Because through us, the world sees him. And so the only thing we have to do is we have to be operating in the right space, the right mindset. Now, you don't have to do things trying to trick Yah because he sees the heart. Only thing you got to do is commit to this walk and commit to this lifestyle, which he gave us. And he said all those other things that you're trying to get, all those breakthroughs that you're trying to break through, all those things that are against you, he said, I'll remove those things. But as humans, it's hard for us just to commit because Yah not moving as fast as we would like him to move. But we have to believe that his timing is perfect. Now, whether you believe it or not, his timing is perfect. And he'll give you what you need when you need it. If he don't give it to you, that means that you didn't, despite how you feel. So every day I wake up and I say, Told Yah. Now I'm going to still fight for what I want because I believe that he can give me the desires of my heart. And if it's not according to his will, I'm like, ooh, Yah, show me, tell me so I can stop with this expectation that I have. So I'm excited about this feast. I believe this is number 28. I think for me, number 28. And I'm asking y'all to give me 28 more. I'm not going to be sitting here doing this. You might have to nudge me a little bit and wake me up from time to time in another 28 years. Hey, man, does anybody have anything that they want to offer that they got from the class or something that we may not have discussed that you think the class could benefit from before we close out? Does it make sense with understanding the gospel? Now I want you to take your time. And I don't want you writing a whole thesis or dissertation. And you don't necessarily have to share it with me. But I think it's easier when you write things out versus trying to formulate in your mind. You write a couple of paragraphs and show how Purim is part of the gospel. And I think that it will greatly help you, in your ministry to have a deeper concept of what this is and why we do it and be able to have a conversation with people regarding this feast. Does anybody have anything they want to add? I'll grade it. 2 paragraphs. Go past 3, you get an F. No, I think that when you leave it open-ended, then people start to ramble and go on and on. B, get to the point of how it's part of the feast. All right. Nothing? No? Going once? Purim is next Wednesday, Thursday. 12 and 13th. So eat out a couple of days less, and you'll be here 4 days in a row. So we'll be here Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, and Sunday. The moon service is when? Okay. All right, so we're going to get ready to close. We want to thank those that have joined us on our live stream. We want to encourage you to go to our Facebook page if you have any questions. Hashtag Restoration Gospel. You can inbox myself and or Elder Nate. We'll make sure that we'll get back with you. We want to remind you of our new website, tvbethel.net. Did you guys check it out? No? www.tvbethel.net. We want you to check it out. We got a new design, and we've added a whole bunch of new functions to the site. So we encourage you to visit us on that site. And we encourage you to visit our new podcast page, website at restorationpodcast.com. That's brand new as of last week. We have a number of different podcasts we just released last week. So we want to encourage you to go to our Facebook page at My Restoration Podcast. We have, I think, 10, 11 podcasts now. We have 2 more hours, 2 more episodes. We're going to drop in about 3 weeks. But we want to encourage you to check those out. So with that, we're going to get ready to close out. Again, we thank those that joined our Nashville congregation. Yah's willing, we'll be back here next week, 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. On behalf of our late restored Chief Shepherd, Dr. Armand, on behalf of Bethel Temple and College, I'm Elder Al. I want to depart you as I greeted you by saying Shabbat